we've talked about oil, we've talked about coal, we've talked about gas, a little bit about hydro, uh, and those trends. And in passing, we've talked about intermittent renewables that are new. But I think it bears looking at these things more because despite every effort by every one of the traditional fuel types to insist that renewables, have only limited use. The trend lines, every time you open up a Energy Information Administration monthly report, which I recommend you take a look at, the lines for the renewables and the economic factors and all those things keep going in a direction that pretty much explains why there's a lot of private investment in these technologies in a way there isn't in the others. And so I think it deserves more attention. Let's go to the first slide. All right. Now, the first thing that is worth talking about was very popular, and we may hear more about it again in the Obama administration. And maybe it's because Mr. Obama went to very elite schools and taught at the University of Chicago, but he put an emphasis on the word smart. Whatever it was, he was for it if it was smart. Okay, so he talked a lot about smart grids, which essentially takes the existing grid and introduces metering and monitoring and switching technologies that are very new, and with enough, late breaking, emerging monitoring, metering, and switching technology, adding storage, and we'll get to that in a moment, you can do a lot more with the grid than just take power from thermal plants, whether they're nuclear or coal or gas, and some hydro. You can actually play with things that are quite intermittent. And the bigger the grid, the better the switching technology and transmission technology and metering and monitoring technology. You can be pretty agile in moving things like wind and solar in and out and onto the grid without it causing the kinds of rises and falls in supply that would cause brownouts or blackouts. So there was a lot of enthusiasm, as I say, in the Obama years for investing in a smart grid. Now, the takeaway that's not generally discussed is this is an endless project. To do it costs, you can do it with $1 or $1 bazillion. You can do it poorly or well, efficiently or inefficiently. It is not something that's one and done. That's for sure. But the idea would be that if you smartened your grid, you could have more sources of electricity on the grid, and that would make the grid more resilient to disruptions in any one of the supplying technology. I should say generators, the thermal, nuclear, gas and coal, and even hydro. If there was some problem, well, you might be able to use storage and intermittence to fill in. And it might reduce your need for as many generators, whether they were peak or base load. Anyway, that was the thought. And why don't we go to the next slide? Now, some of the technologies that a smart grid would exploit, as I mentioned before, direct current transmission lines that could move lots of wind power many, many hundreds or even more miles away to a market without loss or a whole lot of leakage. Monitoring and metering. I mean, many of you probably, if you have a basement or a fuse box, will find a metering box nearby that your utility puts in so that they don't have to come in and actually read your meter. It just sends a signal. That's partly what we're talking about. I didn't have any good switching technology pictures, but switches matter, and this is the unsung, unnoticed technology. The importance of switches that are smart enough to know when they're being loaded or are underloaded, and reporting and all the like. Capacitors that can store short, for very brief periods and lots of energy and release it. And then, of course, batteries, which could take intermittent, generation when it's producing and nobody wants it, and at least store it somewhere. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Now, I just want to make sure everybody understands the next concept. Smart grids are not necessarily distributed generation, but the technology that you use to make a grid smart can also make it possible for you to create what they call microgrids. And that allows you to take care of a very small market like a university or a large military base or a small community, and supply it with its electrical needs without relying very or at all on the grid. And in the right-hand area, you can see the consumer is a building of some sort, commercial or residential, doesn't matter. And instead of getting much of its electricity, or I should say all of its electricity from a central plant distributed over a central grid system, it can take all kinds of electricity either in the building or near the building and not rely on the grid. And you can see on the left-hand side, the model that prevailed from the early 1900s to basically still dominant today is you have a central generating plant and you use a single grid and people connect to it, and that's it. All right, let's go to the next slide. Now, once you start relying on the smart technologies and you set up the possibility of having what are called microgrids. And that then raises an important question. The current model uses the grid as the main distribution system for electricity. And what you do is you'll see people, well, I have rooftop solar panels and I have a little Tesla battery in my garage, and I rely on the grid, and then occasionally I'll use my battery. And if I have any surplus from my rooftop solar, I have to dump the surplus back onto the central grid so they can use it. And I get paid a little. In this situation, the grid is the main event, and the backup systems, batteries, solar, or even little thermal generators are the backup. Now, you can flip that, where if you get enough microgrids, you still have the grid, but you use that as a secondary source of electricity when and if your microgrids are not doing the work that you need them to do to supply your demand. And one of the big questions for utilities right now in the various states is, to what extent do they want the model to be one or the other, and how quickly do they want to move from one to the other? You can use smart technology to fortify the grid and make it even more dominant as a delivery system, or not. Now, I was asked at one point to talk to certain offices in the Pentagon about the resiliency of the centralized grid system, and I said, well, it's not very good, and it's just naturally vulnerable to a lot of natural things, including my favorite, squirrels. I just this morning I live in Delaware right now. My electricity went out, and I called in, and they said, "Well, it was squirrels. You know, they had bitten into some things." And this happens, you know, somewhat routinely. Raccoons are also apparently very good at this. So you can get around some of that vulnerability if you want to invest in the microgrid model as a more primary. But you know, when you do that, you have to recognize that you're obsoleting an awful lot of capital investment. And you know, when people buy something, they don't like to be told, "Oh, you made a mistake. You should use that. Here's something better. You need to buy this." Again, it isn't for nothing that large clumps of capital tend to, you know, have a lot of inertia. Innovation, you know, works best in fields where there aren't really big clumps of capital that people have to invest in just to do business. The electrical utility system model, and certainly up until now, has really focused on enormous capital investment assets. And so it's not easy to just say, "Oh, well, we're just going to change." It takes time. It also presents not just economic, but political problems. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Well, you know, here's, you know, one way to look at the direction with regard to smart grids. Certainly people, maybe because it's so poorly defined, say, well, we want to spend more and more on it. Okay. But I mean, you get the sense that the technologies, at least for smart grid, which enable the microgrids, is a comer. It's not something that's going to diminish or go away anytime soon. Next slide. Now, there is a problem with renewables. And I think this is the a somewhat challenging view graph, but one once mastered explains the challenge. The challenge with renewables, obviously, and I shouldn't say obviously, but what you hear all the time to the point at which you almost want to scream, it only works when the wind blows and the sun shines. Yeah, and this is kind of like the phrase we heard. I guess with in the last 10 years, moving forward, you know, there's sort of this cliche. It's a cliche. Okay. But it's not without some substance. And in fact, operationally, it's pretty significant. When you have the sun shining, there's an awful lot of electricity that gets thrown up onto the grid. And because the cost of solar energy and wind is so low, I mean, in some cases, less than a lot of cases now, less than a few cents per kilowatt, you know, like 2. You know, it'd be like half the price of baseload natural gas, which is, you know, pretty darn cheap. And certainly hydro can be extremely cheap. That if you dump more of this at a certain time, there'll be a market preference to use it. And what that then means is you have to turn off your baseload generator or turn it down. And you don't really want to do that because baseload generators like nuclear power plants and big coal plants, et cetera, are actually designed just to operate at like a very high rate of capacity, but you don't fluctuate it. I mean, because when you raise and lower the power output of a nuclear power plant, you're basically changing the amount of reactivity in the core. And that's sort of the way you get fuel failures. You don't really want to do that very, very much. And so they're not designed for peak production or being turned down a lot. So let's get to this duct. What this shows is the amount of electricity in any given year throughout the day. Now, you remember that would be put up on the grid. Now, this is called, let's see here. I got to get rid of, having a little difficulty. Why am I viewing Brooks' application here? All right. It's on the screen covering something. Well, remember that I said at night, after work, there may be a bit of a demand for electricity, but that when you go to sleep, the amount of electricity that is consumed goes down, and then it comes up again during the day, and then goes down slightly, and then all right, that peak demand curve works as follows with this what's called the duck curve. If you take a look, it references the net load, which is to say, in 2020, let's take that because that's now. There is so much solar and so much wind in the California grid that during the middle of the day, where you see the number 2020 around 12 p.m., the amount of electricity being produced by renewables is so great that you have to turn off an awful lot of baseload generation. And that dip represents that. Then afternoon, around 6 o'clock, people go home and they turn on their TVs. And by 9 o'clock, you can see to the right, they turn off their TVs and go to bed. The problem is that from about 6 o'clock to 9, there's no solar power in a lot of cases, unless it's daylight savings time. And the wind may not be blowing. So you have to turn on peak load generation to make up the difference. You do not want that. What you want is for the curve to be absolutely as flat as possible, so that the amount of electricity that you're putting on the grid is equal to much more closer to the amount of capacity you have, whether it's intermittent or not. Well, how do you do that? Well, the only way you can really do that is either by importing electricity where it's 6 to 9, so that you don't have to own your own capacity to take care of that demand or turn it on, or you have to have storage. And we'll get to that in a moment. And the trick is to get that number, if you can see in 2020, that curve. Can you help me here, Brooke, with yes, 2020. You want to get enough storage so that when you move from 3 to 9, you are able to supply that electrical demand without turning on any other sources, besides the base load below that number of 2020. And that means you need from where the arrow now is to the tip of around 8 o'clock, that has to be supplied by some form of storage or energy importation outside of the market. So that is the problem with intermittence. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, the traditional battery solution is lithium ion, and you can see these enormous battery factories, both in the West and in Germany, in the US, Netherlands, and in China. Lithium ion batteries are able to supply electrical demand for a few hours, and you know they last a certain amount of time. Their duty cycle, or is improving, and there are dollar figures associated with this. It is not super cheap, but it's now economical enough that people are doing this without government subsidies, if you will. Okay, next slide. There are better batteries that are now coming online for electrical grid storage called flow batteries. These things are able to last lots longer and store lots more electricity. It remains to be seen, how economic they'll be, but California is already buying them and installing them. Here's one that's 2 megawatts and, will flow for 8 megawatt hours, which, is significant. Another idea, which is being explored out in Utah, is compressing air and putting it in salt domes, which we have a certain number of, mostly, I think, in Utah. And you fill that with compressed air, and that air can then be used to spin turbines when you need it. They're thinking about not only servicing the Salt Lake area, but shipping this off to Nevada and California. So this is a major, 1 gigawatt project. That's a big battery. And this, of course, would operate for days if necessary. And so this is, one way to go. It's not that easy to find salt domes, however. They don't grow on trees, but there's an enormous set of them in Utah. Next slide. Another pumped hydro storage simply takes the surplus electricity during the day that isn't being consumed and pumps it literally up to a higher level reservoir that then can be released during the evening to spin the turbine to produce electricity when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, to then make it possible for you to not need any additional electrical capacity to service the 24-hour period. Another way to go is very popular now in the Middle East, and I think you're going to see it in the Southwest more, and that's concentrated solar. This is now coming in around 7 cents per megawatt hour, which compares, let's say, to nuclear, at least an advantage of 4 to 8 cents, which is pretty significant. Essentially, you use mirrors to heat up a tower that contains sodium, and it melts, and it's very, very hot, and it stays hot enough to produce steam all evening long. So you combine this with photovoltaics, and you get 24/7 electricity that does not rely on the burning of any nuclear or fossil fuels. Next slide. Now, everybody thinks they know how these technologies will be used, and they continually are proven wrong. My favorite is everyone thought that, well, you would use battery storage to make it possible to deploy renewables right away. In fact, one of the most popular uses of battery storage is with natural gas-fired plants. The way this works is, remember I said idling reserve or spinning reserve for peak load? Well, that's what natural gas plants frequently are used as, the smaller ones. But what if you ran the plant and stored enough electricity in the batteries that when you got a dispatch call, hey, we want cheap electricity, what do you got? You threw 30 minutes or an hour of the battery storage up while you start up your gas-fired plant, and you keep it idle the other times. Well, first of all, you save a lot of money. Second of all, the overall plant produces much less pollutant because it's not operating all the time, unlike spinning reserves for peak load normally operate. So this became very popular, and is not just here in California, but in Australia and other places. Again, no one predicted this. So one of the problems of trying to sit in judgment about what we should invest in is it presumes you know how things are going to be used and what amounts. I think right now things are so dynamic. Keep saying it. We don't know if our cars will plug into our houses or our houses will plug into our cars, the electric cars. We don't know how many electric cars there'll be, for that matter, and when. I mean, there are all sorts of projections. They seem like they're coming, but I have my cars are. Let's see, I have one that's 32 years old, 47 years old, and my new cars are only 15 years old. They're in mint condition. I don't, I don't really want to buy an electric vehicle just because, well, my cars are old. You know, when I can't get parts, I'll give up. But I mean, the fleet life of cars used to be 4 or 5 years. It's now closer to 12, you know, on average. And so, you know, fleet penetration of electric vehicles, we don't exactly know how that works. It may take a while.